Good evening, everybody hear me? Okay, very good. احنا مستنيين ابونا يصلي ولا نبتدي على طول؟
ابونا ان شاء الله اوريدي وابونا موجود.
طب خلاص اهلا ابونا سلام ابونا ازي قدسك؟ خلاص I'll share my screen and we'll begin. Okay, it's projecting well? Okay, very good. All right, we'll begin so that we don't take up too much time. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God, amen. Thank you for this invitation. It really is, Yani, a wonderful blessing. Something I really don't deserve, but I hope to learn with you as we discuss leadership in service. What does it mean to have leadership? Or what does leadership in service itself mean? We can interpret the word service in so many different ways. I have some of the slide in front of you, some of the different ways that service is applied, organization, results, management, performance. How do you gauge leadership, if it's successful or not successful? In the church, at least in the Coptic church, we can say, okay, the leadership of the church is the priesthood, the Pope, the bishop, the priest, and so on and so forth. And that is indeed leadership in the church. But is that where it ends? Yani, when I say what is leadership in service, in church service, do I just describe Abuna or the bishop or the synod, Megma, or the Pope? How is leadership defined in the church? As we go through the next few slides and we discuss this, you will understand, I hope, that true service has nothing to do with, or true leadership in service has nothing to do with the rank of the person in question. Of course, they do have an administrative leadership role. The hierarchy of the church is there for a reason, and we'll hopefully touch on that a little bit later. But in terms of myself as a servant, or any one of you, or any one of us who is involved, في الخدمة في الكنيسة, how do I understand what leadership is? Am I a leader, or am I reporting to a different person who is assigned the leadership position? Before we can talk about leadership, I think we have to define what is service. We all know, we all serve in one capacity or another. And by the way, I always like to stress this to all the servants. الخدمة في الكنيسة ما هياش بس مدارس الأحد. يعني the service in the church is not just Sunday school. Many of us are Sunday school servants, or youth servants, or a youth ministry, whatever you would like to call it. But service can be in many, many different capacities. And we have to understand that what's going to apply to Sunday school servants should also apply to all other servants in the church in whatever capacity, hidden or open, serving old, serving young, serving male, female, serving rich, poor, serving physically or spiritually, whatever it may be. What we will be discussing, whenever we discuss service, it should be applying to all servants, not just Sunday school service. So we have to understand, what is my service? What is the goal of my service? Why am I here? Am I serving because I was asked to serve? Am I serving because Abuna told me, or Amin al-Khidma told me? Or am I serving because I want to serve? Because I feel that God has called me to serve in one way or another. And what is the goal of my service? Am I doing this so others can benefit? Or am I doing this for my own benefit? Or am I doing it for both? These questions have to be in the back of our minds as we discuss service before we can even talk about what is leadership in service. The one common denominator for all aspects of service, it is required of all Christians. We all have to be serving. So that if we take that statement, that should redefine what service is. If every single Christian is a servant, that means that the title of service really means nothing. And that is in fact true. Whether I have a certain title, that I am a Sunday school servant, or I am a youth servant, or I serve in the Filagna, or I serve as مثلا في الكهنوت, or in any other capacity, is really kind of secondary. The primary thing is that as a Christian, I am serving. Once I understand that, it'll make my understanding of what leadership in service is. And you'll realize, I hope, that leadership of service does not require any kind of title. There are three mandatory components of all service: love, humility, and action. Somebody has a question? I'm sorry?
Yes, please. So
Please, go ahead.
can we say that service, since it's required from all Christians, can we say it's a Christian lifestyle or style of living?
Service can be within the church and can be outside the church. There are many services in the secular world that we live in. The Red Cross or soup kitchens or whatever, they are services to the community. So service is not isolated to Christians, but all Christians must serve. I hope that makes sense. Not all services have to be among Christians. There are many services outside of the church, outside of the Christian framework, but all Christians in one way or another have to serve. And if you give me a few minutes to get through the slides, you'll see what I mean by that, because our definition of service has to be clear. Service is not something that is a title. Service is not something that is labeled or even recognized. And as we get through the conversation, I hope to highlight what I mean by that. So does that answer your question?
Not yet, but I'll wait.
Okay. I hope that with a few more slides, it'll be clear what I mean by all Christians are servants. All service, all kinds of service, certainly in the Christian realm, require love, humility, and action. The love and the humility, I want to put those separate from the action. The action is what transfers the love and the humility into service. So I can love my fellow Christian or my fellow human, my fellow neighbor. I can be humble. If I don't put it into action, how is that service? Those two things together, plus the added ingredient of action, is what makes it service. Otherwise, I just have love in my heart. I'm a humble person. You put those two together and then add the third ingredient of action in whatever capacity you'd like to have. That's what becomes service. That service could be in the form of Sunday school. That service can be in the form of prayer for that other person. ما دي خدمة برضو. يعني في ناس, all they do is pray. يعني monks, what do monks do? Yeah, they serve. Yes, they have certain things that the monastery provides and so on and so forth. But a monk or a nun's role primarily is prayer. So they are serving the church. We don't know what they're praying for. We don't see them most of the time when they're praying. They're in their own cells praying. But their prayers are vitally important, not just for the church, but for the world. So you can see that the action of prayer, even if it's not necessarily bringing food, visitations, teaching, lessons, and so on and so forth, is a kind of service. That action is the part that has to change from one example to the next. Love and humility is basically present in every single kind of service. The action, which makes the love and humility service, can vary depending on the kind of service that we are talking about. So what is a servant? We've talked about service for a few minutes here. Now let me translate that and say, what is a servant? We already said a few minutes ago, it's not necessarily one kind of servant or another, but in general, if I'm going to say that every Christian is a servant, how do I define servant? I understand what a Christian is. Every Christian is a servant. What is a Christian? A Christian is a follower of Christ. We can talk about this in much more detail. But for the purposes of this conversation, we'll say a Christian is a son or daughter and a follower of Christ. Every Christian is a servant. Okay, so what is a servant? Just because you follow Jesus, does that make you a servant? Well, to a certain respect, yes, you are a follower of Jesus. But a servant is also a leader, somebody who leads other people to Christianity. So a servant is a follower, because that's what a servant is. خادم. أنا بخدم مين؟ بخدم ربنا، بخدم المسيح أو كنيسته. So I follow Christ. But by the same token, I lead others to Christ. So the true definition of a servant is a follower, but also a leader. ما أقدرش أقول عليا خادم لو أنا ما بجيبش حد للمسيح. That is a misnomer to say I am a servant if I don't bring other people to Christ. Now, I can bring other people to Christ through my teaching. I can bring others to Christ through my prayers. I can bring others to Christ through my example. All those things are true. So a servant is not just somebody who follows, but now all of a sudden, every servant is a leader. You see where I'm going with this? So a leadership role is not isolated to the hierarchy of the church. It's not isolated to His holiness or to His grace or to His reverence, Abuna. A leader is not just the Amin Khidma or Amin al-Marhala or whatever it may be. Every Christian serves in one capacity or another, even if it's just praying for your neighbor. And by serving, I am also leading others to Christ. So if you follow the train of thought that I'm saying here, the definition of a Christian is somebody who follows Christ. The definition of a servant is somebody who leads somebody to Christ. Every single Christian, whether they have a title of a Sunday school teacher or even farash al-Kinisa or whatever it may be, al-Arabni or أي حاجة, is serving the church. The hope and the goal of all service is not just to follow, but also to lead others. If I'm doing my service properly, I am saying, Jesus, Christ, God, I want to be with you. And I run towards Him. And as I'm going, I grab a fellow Christian's hand with me and say, Ta'ala ma'aya, come with me, come let me show you what I have found. Come let me show you, or let's do this together. Let's follow Christ together. Let's lead each other and support each other in our journey to Christ. So a servant is a follower, taban, at least in the church for that matter, has to be a Christian. But by serving properly and by following properly, by my example, by my prayers, or whatever kind of service I serve, I am also leading others towards Christ. So you see what I'm trying to say here is that every single servant, regardless of the title, is a leader in one way or another. Now, we may not be aware of it, but a servant, a true, effective servant, is a follower and a leader. Like this slide shows here, let everything you do lead others to the cross. I'm on my way to the cross, but as I'm going, I want to take others with me. How? By showing them how, by teaching them how, by leading them, by being a good example, or even just by not being a hindrance to them on their way to the cross. So every single servant in the church, who by default is a Christian, has to be a leader as well. His Grace Bishop Yoannis, the late Bishop Yoannis, who wrote in his wonderful book, which I think every servant should have a copy, Paradise of the Spirit, under service, said something beautiful. He said, the goal of service is to let God's love penetrate into every person who is deprived of it. The goal of service is to let God's love penetrate into every person who is deprived. How do I, as a servant, play a role in letting God's love penetrate? Take your pick. Take your pick. It could be just teaching. It could be prayer. It could be visitations. It could be outreach. Whatever it may be, you're transferring, or you're being part of the transference of God's love into the life of the person who is being served. And in that way, I am leading that person to Christ. I am leading that person to the cross. So every Christian, I want to say over and over again so we don't forget this, every Christian who follows what Christ told us to do, to pray, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your might, with all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself, we pray for that neighbor, we are leading them to Christ. Even if it's not something visual or tangible, like Sunday school service is. If you look at it from that perspective, then every Christian is a servant and every servant is a leader. Our understanding of service, unfortunately, those of us who serve Yani in the Sunday school format, this is the perfect Sunday school that we imagine. Class is full, students are there, they have their Bibles, they have their notebooks, they're paying attention, they're participating, the class is quiet, it's behaved, everybody stands up for prayer, everybody shows up on time. Let's be realistic, this never happens. As much as we like it to, maybe in the younger grades it happens, but as you know, those of you who have ever served youth meetings and college and so forth, the older the kids get, the harder it is. So instead of this picture that you have in front of you of beautiful classrooms lined up with chairs and students sitting there paying attention to the teacher, it's drag the kids into class, pull them in, convince them, bribe them, trick them, force them. This is the reality that we face. It doesn't mean that it's any less effective, but this is the reality that most of us face when we're serving Sunday school. It's not as easy as the previous slide, which showed the kids sitting there quietly. In this day and age, COVID or non-COVID, virtual teaching has become very, very important, as we're doing right now. I'm giving this talk virtually. I don't know what the situation is in Virginia. In New Jersey right now, we are still able to sit in person. Masks have become mandatory again because of the rise in the Delta variant. There is some talk that they may start limiting attendance again. Thank God so far that hasn't become an issue. But my point is, now add an extra element, add an extra variable to Sunday school, the virtual, where the servant and the kids aren't even in the same classroom together. So it's a challenge that we all face. I always like to go back to a biblical reference whenever we talk about service. Service examples, the Bible is replete with service examples of people who were successful in the service, who were driven in the service, who were guided by the Holy Spirit in the service, and were not serving because of any benefit to themselves, but were serving because of the benefit to those who they are serving. They took passion, they took a love and satisfaction in leading others to Christ for no benefit of their own, just to share the wonderful news that they had with those that they served. This slide here in front of you is a caricature or a drawing of Joshua standing before the people of Israel as they were embarking on their journey into the promised land. Moses had led them through the desert for 40 years. And as we all know, Moses was not allowed to enter into the promised land. So then he handed it over to Joshua. God told him, I need to hand it over to Joshua. And Joshua was to take them the rest of the way into the promised land, cross the Jordan River, and to enter into the promised land. This here in front of you, the writing that's on the left here is the first chapter, or from the first chapter of the book of Joshua. If you haven't never read it or haven't read it recently, I encourage you to read it. It's a very, very strong message. I'm only going to highlight the yellow part here. The promises that God made to Moses were being repeated here by Joshua, and the part in yellow, which I'm going to highlight, says the following: only be strong and very courageous, that you may observe to do according to the law which Moses my servant commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right hand or to the left, that you may prosper wherever you go. This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate in it day and night, that you may observe to do according to all that is written in it. The book of the law shall not depart from your mouth. The book of the law, al-Ho al-Injil, or the teachings of God, the commandments, shall not depart. This is your fuel, so to speak. Wherever you go, whatever you do, and whatever people you encounter, the book of the law shall not depart. Whether you go left or whether you go right, or you shouldn't go left or shouldn't go right, stick with the book. I like to take this do not go left and do not go right to represent the Orthodox way. Also, the Kidmet Orthodox means straight. If you break a bone, you go to an orthopedic surgeon. If you need braces because you have crooked teeth, you go to an orthodontist. Ortho means straight. Dox or doxology means prayer or worship. So the straight worship, or the original worship, is the Orthodox worship. And Joshua here is kind of reminding the people of Israel, do not divert your attention from what God taught you. and keep the book of the law in your mouth at all times. Do not depart from the book. So how does that help me as a servant? How do I lead? If this is what God wanted from Moses, and this is what God wanted from Joshua to tell the people, how do I do that? Very simple. By using the principles that I learn in the Bible and apply those to my service. We can talk about Joshua as a servant, as a leader. We can talk about Moses as a servant, as a leader, and they would be wonderful to teach us how to be servants. But I want to talk about somebody who is maybe a little bit less well known, Nehemiah. If you know the story of Nehemiah, just to refresh your memories, after the exile or during the exile, some people were left behind in Jerusalem, but the majority were taken into captivity, into Babylon. Nehemiah and some of the other people who were there wished they could go back. They remembered the good old days, or at least had heard about the good old days before the exile, when they were held captive in Babylon, and they wanted to go back to the homeland, to Jerusalem, where the house of God was, where the temple was, where their predecessors and their ancestors worshipped and spent time with God and learned about God, and God manifested himself to them. So Nehemiah inquired about the temple and its condition, and he was told that it was in a very, very bad state. So he got permission to go back and to start to rebuild the temple. It's not as easy as just going back and rebuilding the temple. It took a lot, and he had to get permission from the Babylonian leaders and so forth to go back and to take people with him to build. I want to highlight a few things about the life of Nehemiah. And as I highlight those things, I want each one of us to think, am I doing this in my service? Because this example of Nehemiah, in addition to Moses and Joshua and so many other people, is the criteria that's necessary to be a successful, fruitful servant and to be a leader in my service. Again, what is a leader? Somebody who leads others to Christ. مش ضروري يبقى عنده رتبة أو يبقى عنده name or a title or whatever it may be. لا, leading others to Christ through my service. That makes me a leader, a good leader. So let's together kind of see a couple of the highlights of Nehemiah's life. First thing is he was not discouraged by difficulty. I just cut and pasted some of the verses here from the book of Nehemiah. As they rebuilt the wall, they were ridiculed and mocked. Their enemies did everything possible to discourage them. They threatened to tell untrue stories about Nehemiah. Nehemiah listened but persisted. Nehemiah knew that he was doing a great work. Chapter 6, verse 3, and could not come down from the wall to debate with the enemies, persisted even when the adversary came. Service is not easy. In fact, if your service does not have any obstacles, you might have to ask yourself, is something wrong? I'm not trying to tell you that service should be difficult. And I'm not trying to tell you that look for difficulty, create problems. No, of course not. We want the service to be successful. We want the service to be fruitful. But any of you who have served any period of time know that the enemy, Satan, and his dominions is not going to sit back and watch any service become successful quietly. La bil'aks, anytime the church starts to grow, anytime a service starts to grow and grow quickly and well, we should be praying for the service. We should be praying for the service regardless, but especially if things are going very, very well and it becomes very fruitful in a short period of time. We have to have our guard up and be aware that this difficulty is around the corner. The enemy, as it says in the Bible, or the devil, is crouching, waiting for any opportunity to strike. And the best way to strike is in the service. Christ, when he was taken and arrested, it dispersed all the apostles. Who would have thought that they would come back and establish and be the members of the early church? So when a service is successful, always be on guard that something may happen. It was once said that the widest door for the devil to enter into a church is through the door of service. The widest door for the devil to enter into a church is through the door of service. Why? Because human nature is there. Pride, arrogance, resentment, disagreement, laziness, judgment, whatever you want to call it. despondency, complacency. The widest door for the devil to enter into the church is through the door of service. Nehemiah was not discouraged. He kept his guard up. He refused to give in to the pressures around him, and he continued to lead. So a leader is somebody who is consistent. Again, title or no title, I have to be consistent in my service. I have to be consistent in my dedication towards whatever I'm doing. Even if I'm a monk, even if I'm praying for a fellow person and I am not serving in any tangible way, be consistent in that. Do not let the devil take you away or redirect you. What kind of a leader is a leader who gives up? What kind of a leader is a leader who is distracted? What kind of a leader is a leader who is complacent or judgmental? It's not that does not play a role, does not fit the role of a leader. So do not be discouraged by difficulty, because difficulty will come. All service will face difficulty. And Antonius and Macarius, they led hundreds and thousands of people. They didn't go and recruit anybody. We don't hear about them going into the streets of the cities and saying, come with me, I'll make you monks. Come with me to the desert and I'll show you how to be a monk. But people went to them and established communities. And they started communes and monasteries in the desert. How? Just by their life, just by the example that they led. It doesn't mean that they didn't face difficulties. They faced a lot of difficulties. God help us if we ever face any of the difficulties that they faced. And the Macarius, I think an Macarius faced mish best temptations, spiritual temptations. He faced physical battles with the devils. They would appear to him. The demons would appear to him in physical form and physically abuse him, physically fight him, punch him, wrestle him to the ground, sometimes almost to death. That's the kind of difficulties that these men faced. We are not capable of facing that kind of difficulty. Our difficulty is nothing compared to theirs. But be aware that whenever service grows, you will face difficulty. And these are two wonderful people to look at for examples. The second thing is keep the real purpose before the people. A leader is always somebody who says, come with me, not for me, not because of me, but because of the purpose that we're going to, the cross. It's easy for people to forget the purpose behind the vision, even as they work to fulfill it. I'm reading this because I don't know what the font is on the screen in front of you. The vision was to rebuild the wall, but the wall was not the important part of the vision. The wall was a means to a larger purpose. What Nehemiah and his people were really about was reclaiming their identity as people of faith. What was at stake was not just the wall, but indeed their very faith. Chapter 8, verse 12. Chapter 8 and chapter 12. Nehemiah had to make sure that people were reminded of their ancient faith because their task was tied to a larger purpose. احنا دلوقتي في صيام العذراء. كل سنة طيبين. Every church has an icon of St. Mary, or maybe multiple icons of St. Mary. Of course, on the iconostasis, there's an icon of St. Mary. You may have other icons hanging in the church for St. Mary. The Coptic tradition is a beautiful tradition, but as you know, there are many other traditions for the icon of St. Mary. Some of them are Byzantine, some of them are Western. They all have a different flavor, but they all have a beautiful message of one kind or another to St. Mary. One of my favorite ones, I'm sorry I don't have a picture of it on the presentation, maybe I should have done one, is the icon of St. Mary. As you know, she's always to the right of Christ because the queen is at the right hand. She's always to the right, and she's holding Al-Masih in her left hand. She's holding Christ in her left hand. Without getting into the iconography of the tradition and so forth, one of the most beautiful traditions, I have a small picture here. I'm going to hold it up to my camera. I don't know if it'll show, but I'll try. I don't know if you can see. Do you see it?
Yes.
Okay. If you look at this icon, she's holding Christ in her left hand, and she's pointing to him with her other hand. There are many, many things to learn from the icons, and if we had time, maybe in the future, we'll talk about a Coptic iconography or iconography in general. But one of the important, or the most important message of this particular icon in my eyes is what is she doing? This is an icon of St. Mary, but who is she diverting the attention to? To Christ. So even though the icon is dedicated to her, she's saying, don't look at me, look at him. Don't look at me as his mother, as the Theotokos. Look at Christ, who is the Savior. And that's what Nehemiah was doing. The real purpose behind the service was not himself. It was their faith and to rebuild the temple. The goal of having a place to worship and a place to pray. So a real leader, a good leader, a successful leader is not leading for the sake of him or herself, is leading to where he or she is going. Do you remember the analogy I gave you a few minutes ago? He is a servant. He is going to the one that he is serving, but he is grabbing somebody else with him. Not saying, come with me because I want to show you what I learned. No. Come with me and I'll show you who I am following so we can follow him together. That's what a real leader does. That's what a successful leader does. And that's what an honest leader does, just like the icon of St. Mary. It is the icon of St. Mary. But because of her humility and because of her love, and the example that she gives us is, no, don't focus on me, she says, focus on him. Look at that beautiful humility. Don't focus on me, focus on him. So the real purpose before the people was not Nehemiah, was not to follow Nehemiah, but together we build the wall. We build the wall of the temple, and we start to rebuild the place where we meet God and serve God. Don't lose sight of the big picture. Many times, and you may have heard this before, I think Qadasat al-Anba used to say this all the time, in serving the house of the Lord, it's easy to forget that you're serving the Lord of the house. We get so caught up in our service and the details of the service and making sure that this is done right and this is done wrong and this is done on time and so on and so forth, and the structure, we get so caught up in the service of the Lord that we forget that we are actually serving the Lord of the house. الهدف الخدمة. In the end, it is worship. Service is a form of worship. Service is a form of becoming closer to God and to be united with God. And by helping others or by leading others to unite with God, not to unite with me, not to serve for the sake of serving, not to serve so I can be called a khadim or a khadima or amin khidma or whatever it may be. The service is because I want to be closer with Christ. That is the big picture. Sometimes we lose sight of that. A good leader does not forget that. Prayer is essential to know God's will. Another important part that Nehemiah showed, or another important aspect that Nehemiah showed. Fundamental act for people of God. God's leaders and God's people must be in the right place to hear God's voice. God can speak to us at any time, but if we are not turning our hearts towards God to seek his guidance, it is more difficult for God's vision to reach our hearts and also, by the way, to reach others. The prophet Habakkuk climbed into the tower believing that God had a vision for him and his people. Habakkuk was willing to wait for the vision, but knew that he needed to put himself in a position to receive it. Prophet after prophet after prophet showed us that unless I pray, unless I have a life of prayer, which is a life of communication, commune. We take communion and we think that's where it ends. I took communion. Communion, it's the Eucharist. I'm not going to deny that. But continuing communion to be in union with God continues through prayer. How can I say I am united to somebody if I don't speak to them? Hatta in the liturgy of marriage, when we read the gospel, it says the two shall become one. They are no longer two but one. They are now united in one. So just like a husband and wife are united, we as members of the church, if we want to call ourselves sons or daughter of Christ, members of a church, members of his holy bride, have to be united with him. How else can I be united with him? Okay, yeah, that's nice. You are united with him through chrismation and baptism. You take communion every week. That's wonderful too. But if I don't talk to him, what kind of relationship do I have with him? Just because I call myself a Christian, well, here's my certificate of baptism, and here's my proof that I took communion last week. If I don't have a dialogue with Christ on a regular basis, how am I supposed to say I have a relationship with him? How am I supposed to say I know his will? How is he going to reveal his will to me? I won't know how to lead because I don't even know where I'm going. What kind of a leader am I if I don't know where I'm going? It's the blind leading the blind, as they say. That prayer, that essential component of my service, is for me to understand God's will, to lead me personally in that direction, so that when I try and serve others, When I lead others, whether it's by example or by Sunday school or whatever it may be, they are following the same lead that I am following. So that prayer portion is absolutely essential. What better example in our church anyway was His Holiness Pope Kyrillous, a man of prayer, liturgy every single day. Prayer was essential. How many sermons have you heard, recorded or not recorded, by Emma Kyrillous? Maybe a small one here or there. How many sermons? Negligible. I don't remember anybody saying, yes, he had some sayings here and there, but he didn't have any. I don't remember him having any big books that he wrote or anything like that. There were many books written about him. How did he lead the church through his papacy, through many difficult times, to a level in the church holy enough for the Mother of God to come and appear to our church in Zaytun? How did he do this? And with what? With prayer. No, nothing else. He was not known for anything else. This was a man of prayer. The prayer was the way he led the church, by the way, through very turbulent times. The years before Pope Kyrillous, if you know anything about the church history, were very turbulent times. It was necessary for a man of prayer to be chosen by God to lead our church through these turbulent times and bring it out of these dark years into a renaissance. This man of prayer who led the church was not known for anything beyond his prayer. So the prayer is absolutely essential. Finally, humility. I talked about love. I talked about humility at the beginning, and I said put those together. If you add the element of service, that is what a servant is. But you serve with humility. And that ties in with all the other things that we just said. If I am doing it for myself, there's no humility. I have to be doing it for Christ. He has shown, and this is from Micah chapter 6, verse 8, He has shown you, O man, what is good. What does the Lord require of you but to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God? What a beautiful verse. Walk humbly with God. He doesn't want showy things. Even the things that we do on a regular basis, which is our tradition that we inherited from the apostles and from our ancestors, about liturgies, about fasts, about temgid, about doxologies, about altars and churches and so forth. He accepts those only if we do it with humility. Those things are nothing without humility. If the main goal of me as a deacon to be standing up there so people can hear my voice or know how much of the hymns I memorized, if that is my goal, it will not be accepted in God's eyes or His ears. He said that multiple times. Look at the first chapter of Isaiah. He said, I don't want your incense. I don't want your sacrifices because your heart is not in it. You're not doing it for me. You're not doing it humbly. You're doing it out of pride. You're doing it so you can check off a list and say, I did this or I did that. Humility is the most important of the four characteristics that we just talked about. Our church, as I mentioned before, is full of examples of people who were good leaders. Again, we don't know anything that they did beyond what's written in the books about them, being men and women of prayer, being men and women of peace, being men and women of serenity, being men and women of monasticism. They didn't build any big churches. They didn't write any big books. They didn't go to any ecumenical councils to defend the church. These were very, very, very simple people, but they lived by the four elements that I just mentioned to you that Nehemiah so beautifully showed us in his way of leading. The goal was always God, not himself. He did it with love. He overcame adversity, and he remained humble the entire time that he did it. Emba Beeman has a beautiful, beautiful statement here as I have it on the screen. Wherever you are, do not expect your words to have any influence, and you will be at peace. If you're expecting some change because of your service, then your heart is not in the right place. When you serve somebody and say, you know what, things aren't getting better, he's not getting any closer to God, or the kids are not learning, it makes a difference. Many of you have probably already heard the beautiful story in the sayings of the Desert Fathers about the monk with the basket. He went to his father once in the monastery. He said, Abuna, I don't feel like I'm benefiting from all the habits and the rights and the commandments that you gave me to live in my life. And the father told him, you see that basket over there? Bring that basket to me. Look inside. What do you see? He said, nothing, Abuna, it's empty. He said, take it and go down to the river. Go down to the river and fill it with water and come back. It's far distance. He walked the entire way, filled it with water, and by the time he came back, it's a basket. What do you think is going to happen? All the water seeped out of it. He said, show me inside. What do you see? He looked, he said, nothing, Abuna. I said, good. Now tomorrow go do the same thing. And the day after, and the day after, and the day after. Finally, after a long period of time, the monk said to Abuna, Abuna, can you please enlighten me what I've been doing here for week after week after week? I go to the river every day, I fill it with water, I come back, and you ask me to look inside it, and there's nothing. And he said, to look inside now. And he looked inside it. He said, what do you see? He said, Bardo, I see nothing. He said, is there anything different about the basket? He said, yeah, it's cleaner. He said, there you go. The change can be very gradual. The change may not be what you expect the change to be. Unfortunately, we lose focus, we lose drive, and we lose our willingness to serve because we set up expectations. Min el, the expectations are our expectations. Nikhdim, we lead without setting expectations. Let God worry about the expectations. Just do your part. That's what a servant does. Very quickly, because I think I went over time, I'm going to just go through these slides very quickly. Whenever you encounter problems, be aware that there are two sides to every story. There's different points of view. Are you going to lead? Masalan, let's say you're in an usra and you have two servants who are arguing or disagreeing about something, or Amin al-Khidma bi'ullak or bi'ullik to do this, and you feel that it should be this, or Abuna bi'ullik la, serve this way, and you think it should be this way. There's two sides to every story. Maybe Abuna knows something you don't know, or maybe Amin al-Khidma knows something you don't know. Be sensitive to this and be sensitive to personal matters, because sometimes there's more behind the scenes than we know. And look at these opportunities, look at these struggles in service, especially as you're leading somebody. When you stumble, they stumble. And when they stumble, you stumble. But don't fall. Don't lose faith when you fall. Consider it pure joy, as St. James says, whenever you face trials, because this will make you stronger. You'll learn from experience. It'll make you stronger for the next obstacle that may come ahead. Do not add fuel to the fire. Relax, be an instrument of reconciliation. If you see issues in the service, and if you're leading servants or you're leading others in your service, don't add fuel to any issues. If they come with something that's troubling them, rather than adding fuel to the fire, push it aside and let's say, you know what, let's focus on Christ. Let's leave these issues behind us. This is what I carry around in my service book all the time. I don't serve, I try at least not to serve from the intellect, I serve from the heart. This is limited. This is unlimited because Christ lives here. This is my trying to add my knowledge to make service better. But this, since Christ dwells in here, I take my knowledge, I find what Christ's will is, and in the end, it comes out, and that was what it will make a service successful. Lead like Christ with humility, because trust me, any Christian, any servant is a leader. By the mere fact that you are a Christian, how did the church grow? Can kulluhum leaders? Can kulluhum St. Paul? No, it was called the way. In the early church, they called Christianity the way. What's the way? The way he's going and the way she's going. Okay, follow them. We lead others to Christ, whether we realize it or not. True leadership comes from discipleship. If we know how to be good disciples, people will look at us, they'll follow us, and we will be leaders as well. And glory be to God forever. Amen. I apologize if I went a little bit over time. I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. I hope I answered the question of the person who asked the question at the beginning. I don't know if I was successful in doing that. Did it help? Or are there any other questions that may have come up?